Hello and welcome to Darkhaven Lore. This part of the channel will focus on engaging with the lore and mythology of the various games we play. Videos will be made according to the demands of the community, so do keep an eye out for polls and posts on the channel. A mixture of broad and specialised videos will engage with all manner of subjects, so if this is something that appeals to you, then please do like and subscribe and click the bell notification icon.
Hello everybody, it's Darkhaven here and thank you so much for tuning into the channel. This video is the result of a community poll here on Darkhaven, so please do keep an eye out for the next one, so we can work together to produce things everybody will enjoy. The High Elves, or the Asur as they call themselves, are one of the most ancient and powerful mortal civilizations within the Warhammer world. Hailing from a mighty, mist-shrouded island continent located within the centre of the Great Ocean. The High Elves of Ulthuan are a proud and mighty nation of masterful warriors, peerless mages, and lords of the sky and sea. They are an ancient race with powerful armies and even grander magic, building a grand and almighty civilization who, alongside the dwarves, fought a long-forgotten apocalyptic war which saw some of the greatest and most powerful mortal heroes battle against the great darkness that tried to consume the world many thousands of years ago. Yet their noble and compassionate nature, which was once one of the elves' greatest and most noble characteristics, was soon replaced by a great sense of pride and hubris in their own vanity and superiority. In their blind arrogance, they've only succeeding in shattering their once powerful friendship with the dwarves, culminating in a great war which only crippled these two elder races and shattered whatever bright future there was for this young world. Isolated and alone in a world they no longer control, the High Elves are facing the twilight years of their existence. Their cities no longer bustling with vibrancy and life as they used to be, but now serve as a gloomy reminder of their ultimate impending demise. The time of the High Elves has passed, or so it is said, yet such is their immense pride that they fight on nonetheless, for they consider themselves the true and rightful protectors of this ancient world, and they believe that so long as their civilization persists throughout the ages, this dying world will never fall into complete darkness. If oblivion is indeed to be their fate, they have chosen to face it with arrow nocked and sword held high, defending the world they have loved and protected for so long. So do the white garb hosts of Ulthuan march to war, banners streaming in the wind and every warrior reconciled to death in service of a greater cause, the protection of this very world. The history of the High Elves of Ulthuan is the history of the world. They were once the masters of the mortal realm, and their actions have shaped the fates of many lands. Alas, the High Elves are now passing into twilight, their works and deeds dying alongside them. The empire of the Phoenix Kings, which once ruled entire continents, is now confined to the kingdoms of Ulthuan and scattered overseas outposts. Alabaster cities that once bustled with vibrancy are now naught but empty echoes of a bygone age, and lands that knew nothing but beauty and nobility now reek with the blood and fury of unremitting war. The Reign of Aenarion. Aenarion was the greatest and most tragic of all elf heroes, a doomed champion, a fallen god. He was the mightiest warrior in an age of darkness and constant strife, best loved and most accursed of all the Phoenix Kings of Ulthuan. Aenarion's reign began in a time of terror and strife. The polar gates, once used by the star-walking Old Ones to step from world to world, had collapsed, unleashing a roiling tide of magical energy across the world. In the magic's wake came the demonic legions of the Chaos Gods, who sought to claim the mortal world for their own. Against a foe such as this, the elves stood no chance, for they were unschooled in warfare, and their magic was used only for peaceful pursuits. Ulthuan was soon ablaze with war and slaughter, and the elves pleaded to their gods for salvation. Aenarion was a wanderer who had travelled the length of the world, but who swiftly returned to Ulthuan in its time of need. Realizing that the elves could not long stand against the unfettered fury of chaos, Aenarion battled his way through the land to the shrine of Aenarion. Here he offered himself to the sacred fire and implored Aenarion to save his people. Aenarion made no response, but Aenarion held to his promise and cast himself into the white-hot flames. Yet Aenarion did not die that day. He emerged unscathed from the fires, transformed by Aenarion's divine will from mortal elf to the first and mightiest of the Phoenix Kings. With Aenarion at their head, the children of Ulthuan took the fight to the demons, casting down their champions and hurling their armies back into the realm of chaos. For nearly a century the war dragged on without respite or sign of victory, and the elves began to lose heart. Moments of peace were few, and even these were tainted by the knowledge that the demons would soon return. Even the implacable Aenarion realized that there could be no victory, only a slow and inevitable defeat. Ultimately, it was Caledor, the wisest and most ancient of sorcerers, who would offer salvation. He devised a plan to create a cosmic vortex that would drain magic from the world, and with it the demons who rode upon its fury. It was a desperate plan, with little hope of success, but Caledor, and many like him, thought a last desperate gamble would be preferable to the slow death the elf people were enduring. Aenarion opposed Caledor's plan, calling it the Council of Despair, although in his heart he knew that this war was unwinnable. The Phoenix King was determined to put off the end for as long as possible, rather than risk Caledor's plan failing. Such were Aenarion's charisma and powers of reason that he surely would have changed Caledor's mind entirely. Yet soon thereafter, demons overran Avalon. Astariel, Ever-Queen of Ulthuan and wife to Aenarion, was slain in the attack, and their children could not be found amongst the carnage. Upon hearing of his family's fate, Aenarion was overcome with terrible fury. He swore to kill every demon on the face of the world and declared that he would travel to the Blighted Isle. Dread filled those who heard his words, for it could mean only one thing. Aenarion intended to draw forth the Widowmaker, a weapon of terrible power that had waited, embedded in the great black altar of Cain since the beginning of time. As old as the world itself, it was the ultimate weapon, death itself made manifest. A splinter of the fatal weapon forged for the death god Cain, capable of slaying mortals and gods alike. All knew that to wield Cain's blade was to invite death, damn your soul, and doom your lineage forevermore. Upon learning of his liege's intent, Caledor beseeched Aenarion to relent, but he would not be dissuaded. Ignoring all warnings from mortal and immortal alike, Aenarion vaulted onto the back of Indraugnir, the greatest of the dragons, and set off for the Blighted Isle. The journey was long and arduous, and tested even Indraugnir's might. Winged demons assailed elf and dragon as they travelled, trying to turn Aenarion from his path. The elf gods whispered warnings in Aenarion's ear, but if he heard, he paid no heed. Parting ways with Indraugnir just a few leagues from the altar of Cain, Aenarion walked towards his fate. It is said that even the ghost of his departed wife pleaded with him to turn back. Yet, as he stood before the altar, Aenarion hardened his heart and wrenched free the great blood-dripping weapon, sealing his fate and that of his people. When Aenarion returned, those elves most embittered by the war flocked to his side, and he created a kingdom in the dismal land of Nagarath. There, to the surprise of everyone, he took another wife, the beautiful seeress Morathi. In time, Morathi bore him a second son, who they named Malekith. Soon after, the court of Aenarion earned itself a dark reputation, and the elves of other lands were reluctant to go there. Tales of cruelty at Aenarion's court began to spread across Ulthuan. Even Caledor led his dragon riders south to his own land. It is said that Caledor's departure angered Aenarion greatly, but the demon struck again before his wrath could bear fruit. Such was the size and ferocity of the demonic attack that it became obvious to all but Aenarion that the war was lost and the world was doomed to eternal darkness. Caledor, fully aware of Aenarion's incipient madness, decided that there was only one thing left he could do. He called together a convocation of the greatest High Elf sorcerers then living and assembled them on the Isle of the Dead. Aenarion was left with no choice. He assembled his forces and moved to defend the mages on the Isle of the Dead. At the centre of Ulthuan, the two forces met. Dragons so numerous that their wings darkened the sky descended upon the Chaos host. Elves and demons were slain in their thousands, and the death agonies of monsters filled the sea with foam. As the creation of the vortex began, the seas churned and a terrible wind blew from the north. The skies darkened and raw magic lashed and tortured the earth. At the last, Aenarion, with only his faithful Draugr beside him, fought a bloody battle against 4 greater demons of the Chaos Gods as they strove to breach Caledor's wards. It was a battle no mortal could ever win, yet Aenarion's fury and determination that day set him amongst the ranks of the gods. One by one, the foul creatures fell beneath the sword of Cain, though Aenarion was mortally wounded in return. While the battle raged, the High Elf sorcerers chanted the spell that would create the vortex. Chain lightning flickered, the world shuddered. For a moment, all was silent. Then the mountains shivered. Terrible energies pulsed between earth and sky. From the mountain tops, bolts of pure power leapt to converge over the Isle of the Dead. While Aenarion and his outnumbered army fought, the sorcerers struggled to complete their ritual. One by one they died, the weakest succumbing first as the magic that they sought to control burned out their minds. Even as Aenarion defeated the 4 demons, the ritual was finally completed, or at least partially so. The High Elf sorcerers had succeeded in opening a vortex to drain away the raging magic, but were trapped within it, eternally keeping it open, forever held in their battle with chaos. His foes defeated, but his body ruined, Aenarion climbed wearily upon the back of the wounded Draugr and made once more for the blighted isle. Barely managing to complete the journey, Draugr crashed to the ground on the shores of that dismal island. Trembling from fatigue and the terrible wounds to his ancient body, Draugr gave one last bellow of defiance and died. Alone, Aenarion crawled back to the altar of Cain. He knew that should anyone take the weapon of Cain, they could rule the world, and so he thrust it back into the rock from whence it came. Then, it is said, he lay down beside the ravaged and torn bulk of his beloved steed and passed from that age of the world. The immediate effects of Caledor Dragon Tamer's ritual were a series of magical storms, earthquakes and tidal waves that ravaged the land for 3 days. Thousands died as the shores of Ulthuan were swept clear by monstrous waves, ships were sunk, and the sky was split by lightning bolts. When the storms abated, the polar gates were sealed, and the demonic legions were gone. Ulthuan was a land in ruins, but at least it had a future. A year to the day after Aenarion disappeared, the princes of Ulthuan convened at the shrine of Aenarion to elect a new Phoenix King. The obvious choice was Malekith, Aenarion's son by Morathi. He had grown to be a mighty warrior, a great sorcerer, and an excellent general. But there were those amongst the High Elf nobility who remembered the cruel days of Aenarion's court in Nagaraith, and they doubted that any child raised there could be entirely wholesome. Malekith said that he desired the kingship not for himself, but in honour of the memory of his father. However, if the princes did not call upon him to serve, he would willingly swear fealty to whoever was selected. The princes thought this handsomely said, and took Malekith at his word. From their own number they chose Bel-Shanaar, Prince of Tiranoc, an elf who had distinguished himself in the war and yet was seen as a voice of peace and reason. Morathi shrieked her protest at her son not being chosen, but Malekith calmed her and agreed that the selection was a good one. He was the first to bend his knee to the future Phoenix King. And so began the great days of exploration. Colonies were planted across the face of the world, contact was established with the dwarfs, and a great era of trade and friendship began. Bel-Shanaar, a seaman of wondrous skill, personally visited the new colonies and even ventured to Karaz-a-Karak in the World's Edge Mountains. There he swore an oath of friendship with the High King Snorri Whitebeard. According to the Book of Honor of the Dwarf Hold, Bel-Shanaar gifted Snorri a single casket of Illyrian wine of tremendous value. Keen to show his appreciation, the High King broke the lid with his axe and guzzled its contents in one go, wiping the spillage with his beard as his subjects cheered. It isn't known what the elven courtiers thought of this, nor what Bel-Shanaar felt about receiving 12 barrels of Gut-Strangle's old nasty dwarf ale and a 2-gallon tankard in return. Afterwards, Malekith became his ambassador there. Thus, though none could yet know it, were sown the seeds of tragedy. As the elves spread and multiplied across the face of the world, wealth flowed back into Ulthuan. The elven cities became places of beauty and wonder once again. And, though the folk did not realize it, chaos returned. Slowly, softly, and insidiously. It came in a new guise, and so there was no defenses raised against it. It spread in the form of cults of luxury and pleasure. As the cult's influence spread and their excesses deepened, the Phoenix King grew ever more concerned. Rumors abounded of living sacrifice and unwholesome association with the very darkest of forbidden gods. So it was that on his return to Ulthuan, Malekith found a realm in the grip of suspicion. The cult of excess was strongest in Nagaraith, his homeland, and his mother, the Lady Morathi, had long been a devotee. Indeed, Legend has it she was the one of the founding members and their high priestess. Malekith appeared horrified by what he found in Nagarath. He denounced the entire coven of pleasure worshippers, including his mother, and handed them over to the Phoenix King. Ingratiating himself further with the Phoenix King, he championed the hunt for hidden members of the cults. It seemed that cultists could be found in all levels of society. Nobody was safe from his scrutiny. Military action against the cults seemed inevitable. Malekith called Ulthuan's lords to a council of war at the Shrine of Aenarion. On the eve of the council, the worst of horrors was revealed. Malekith claimed the Phoenix King himself was a secret member of one of these cults. Before Belshazzar could deny this, Malekith had him poisoned. With this act, Malekith had gone too far. No one could believe that the king had been a worshipper of the cults, certainly not the assembled princes, who had all known Belshazzar long and well. Too late, the light of suspicion fell on Malekith. He and his followers had already had the Shrine of Aenarion in their possession. The princes and their bodyguards were trapped within his grasp, and a secret treaty with his king in Nagarath meant an army of cultists would impose Malekith's will on the leaderless elves. Believing that all he had to do was crown himself and slay the princes to ensure his ascendance, Malekith marched into the sacred flame, confident that, like his father before him, he could endure the ordeal. He was wrong. The flame of Aenarion would not suffer his polluted body to pass through it, as many have repeatedly said. Thus did the flame that brought Aenarion miraculous rebirth bring nothing but ruin to his deceitful and treacherous son. Malekith was caught within the fire, his body terribly scarred and burned. It is said that his screams were so terrible that none who heard them could ever cast them from memory. However, Malekith's twisted will was not yet spent. Unable to pass through the fires that even then ravaged his body, he managed to cast himself back into the side of the platform from which he had entered. With their leader on the verge of death, Malekith's followers took their master's body and fled the shrine, leaving most of the elf princes dead and massacring all who stood in their path. The Sundering, an age of tragedy and conflict, was about to begin. With Malekith's betrayal, the elven realms were plunged into turmoil once more. Malekith and his followers fled north to Nagarath. Leaderless, the High Elves did not pursue. Frantic consultations were held between the surviving princes, the chief priest of the Shrine of Aenarion and captain of the Phoenix Guard. It was decided that there was only one elf capable of the task. The third Phoenix King would be Imric, who upon his succession took the name Caledor I, for he was the grandson of the famous mage of the same name. Scarcely had Caledor been affirmed when the legions of Nagarath swept down from their grim realm, bearing Malekith's banner before them. Thus did civil war engulf Ulthuan and the colonies, a desperate conflict in which quarter was neither asked nor given. Malekith himself rode at the head of his host, a dread figure clad in armor as black as his soul. Then, and ever after, he would be known as the Witch King. As the war went on, the folk of Nagarath became ever more desperate, relying on the blackest of sorceries and demonic pacts. Thus did they become known as the Dark Elves. Consumed by madness, the Witch King decided on a final scheme with which he would undo the spells that held together the Great Vortex and return chaos to the world. The demonic legions would march once more upon the face of the world, but this time to the aid of their new allies. Shocked by the turn of events, one amongst the Witch King's court saw this plan for the madness it was, and brought word of it to Caledor. So began a last deadly conflict. As the Witch King and his counselors began their terrible ritual, the greatest wizards of the elves attempted to stop them. But such was the awesome power of the Witch King's dark magic that he and his coven of mages slowly and inexorably gained the upper hand. The heavens shook, the earth trembled. In the far north of the world, the realm of chaos churned and prepared to advance once more. In the camp of the Phoenix King, Caledor prayed to all the gods and to his grandsire to aid him. At dusk, the Witch King and his followers began their final push. Demonic sorcerers came to their aid, and the last spells of the defenders collapsed before their onslaught. From the sky, the triumphant laughter of the dark gods was heard. Then, as the tainted magic touched the Isle of the Dead at the very heart of the vortex, new players entered the game. Mighty figures clad in light sent the surge of mystical power tumbling back to Nagarath. The trapped mages of the Isle of Dead refused to let their work be undone. As the wave of energy reached Nagarath, the island buckled under the titanic stress. Across Ulthuan, earthquakes cast down cities and toppled mountains. A wall of water 1,000 feet high smashed down on Nagarath. The sea rushed in to cover the Dark Kingdom and most of Tiranoc besides. Thousands were slain, drowned by waves, buried by earthquakes, or struck by magical lightning. The shock was felt as far away as the World's Edge Mountains and is recorded in the chronicles of the Dwarf Kings. With the High Elves weakened and in disarray, the surviving Dark Elves retreated northwards and founded the Kingdom of Nagaroth in a bleak and bitter land. For a century, both sides nursed their wounds. Soon, though, there began a long period of sea warfare and skirmishing over the north of Ulthuan as the Witch King sought to gain a foothold once more. Neither side had the strength to dominate, and the Blighted Isle, where the Widowmaker still rested, changed hands several times. During this period, Caledor oversaw the building of the fortresses at Griffin Gate, Phoenix Gate, Elil Gate, Dragon Gate, and Unicorn Gate. Caledor personally led the last expedition to the Blighted Isle and reclaimed it from the Dark Elves. It is said that he stood before the altar of Cain, and for a moment the blade called to him. He stood there for a time, head bowed, and in the end simply said, no. Returning home from the conquest of the Blighted Isle, Caledor's ship was separated from the rest of the High Elf fleet by a freak storm. It was attacked by Dark Elf raiders who set the ship alight. For long hours, Caledor and his crew fought off their attackers, but the Dark Elves gradually gained the upper hand, and the Phoenix King realized that he and his remaining warriors could not win. Rather than fall into the hands of the Witch King's servants and die a miserable, ignoble death, Caledor jumped into the sea, clad in full armor, and committed suicide. Thus passed Caledor the Conqueror. It was a bad end for a great king. Caledor the First had perished, but his legacy remained. For his successor, he left a strong army, a secure line of fortresses in the north, and the most powerful navy in the world. When the Council of Princes chose Caledor's son to succeed him, continuity was foremost in their minds. To an elf people desperate for stability, Caledor II promised a familiar hand at the tiller. Alas, Caledor II shared few of his father's traits. Where his father had been wise, Caledor was foolish. Where the father had been a great general, the son was rash and impetuous. As the elves returned to the old world in strength, trade between the two realms of elf and dwarf grew. Whilst rumours of the elven civil war had reached the ears of the dwarves, they didn't really understand the full extent of the situation. Reaving and kinslaying were completely alien concepts to them, and no dwarf would ever break his oath to his liege lord. Unfortunately, Malekith had been shown the secret trade routes of the dwarves during his period as Bel-Shanar's ambassador, and he now used that knowledge to his own benefit. Dark Elves, garbed as warriors of Ulthuan, fell upon the dwarf caravans, seizing their goods and leaving tokens of their passage that the dwarves could not help but trace back to the Elves of Ulthuan. Suspicion fell instantly upon the High Elves, and High King Gotrek Starbreaker demanded a recompense. When word of this demand reached Caledor, his reply was immediate and undiplomatic. He sent a message saying the Phoenix King did not answer demands, but granted pleas. In turn, King Gotrek sent a blunt reply saying he made pleas to neither elf nor god, and demanded twice the recompense because of the implied insult. When the ambassador entered his court, Caledor sent the dwarf ambassador back with his beard shaved off, and said that if Gotrek wanted compensation, he should come to Ulthuan, beg before him, and collect it. Thus began the War of the Beard, born from the dangerous combination of honor and stiff-necked pride. Dwarf armies quickly laid siege to the trading city of Tor Alessi, and Gotrek swore an oath that he would have his hoard of gold or find its equal weight in elf blood. If he were to fail on his oath, he would take the Slayer's path and shave his head to compensate for lost honor. It was a mighty oath. The beardless ambassador had already become a troll slayer from the shame of having his beard shaved. The dwarves were determined that their king should not endure a similar fate. Upon hearing of the dwarf attack, the Phoenix King was outraged. He instantly dispatched an expedition to relieve Tor Alessi. Indeed, so mighty was the fleet, and so great was the army that it bore, that many of the Phoenix King's advisors feared that Ulthuan had been left all but defenseless, should they suffer another attack. Caledor flew into a towering rage and dismissed their fears as groundless. Despite the arrival of Caledor's great host, the war dragged on. The fortress cities of the dwarves were virtually impregnable. The dour, stalwart dwarf troops were quite unlike any foe the elves had faced before, displaying the tenacity and stubbornness for which they have become renowned. The dwarves simply refused to give up or admit defeat, even when hopelessly outnumbered. For their part, the dwarves were astonished by the power of the elf forces. They had judged the strength of Ulthuan by that of the least of its provinces. The huge armies of knights and disciplined infantry were not what they had expected. Still, in true dwarf fashion, they were not about to admit to a mistake, especially to an elf. The war engendered a legacy of hatred and bitterness that was to last for thousands of years. In response to the beard shaving incident, the vengeful dwarves chopped down entire virgin forests simply to spite the elves. In revenge, the elves poisoned the tarns and underground lakes from which the dwarves drew their water, and a great sickness spread throughout the World's Edge mountains. Both sides fought till nearly their entire military strength was spent. Tired of their lack of success, Caledor II dismissed his generals and took command of the elven host personally. It was his last great mistake. At the 14th siege of Tor Alessi, Caledor II was cut down by King Gotrek, who snatched the phoenix crown from his bloodied corpse and took it in payment for the elves' insolence. With this final victory, the dwarves withdrew, claiming their honor was satisfied. Any petitions to return the phoenix crown were greeted with an invitation to come and plead for it. The first phoenix crown remains in the great vault of Karaz Akarak to the present day, an enduring source of festering hatred and recrimination between the two peoples. There are more histories here to tell, but I do feel that we have covered what are, in my opinion, the essentials. I will happily return to the more obscure parts of High Elf history another time. Since those ancient events, the world has grown darker. Despite the series of magical wards raised around the island in the reign of Bel-Koradis, Norse raids on Ulthuan have become ever more numerous. A horde of goblins led by Grom the Paunch of Misty Mountain even managed to pillage eastern Ulthuan. Dark Elf raiders have continued to commit innumerable acts of piracy. The promise of a new golden age of peace has faded, and the elves and their new allies have looked once more to their weapons. For the elves, the present holds both the promise of renewal and the threat of destruction. Their old enemies have grown stronger, while they in turn have become weaker. Ulthuan can still muster the mightiest fleet in the known world, and its armies are rightly feared by its foes, and yet the High Elves are a shadow of their former glory. Indeed, many on Ulthuan feel the greatest days of the elves have passed, yet every year brings new opportunities to win glory and fight against evil. There are still mighty elf heroes, courageous warriors and mages willing to stand against the dark powers, and the mighty dragons, though few in number, are turning restlessly in their long sleep. In the north, the Witch King stirs once more, and the Widowmaker haunts the dreams of warriors, singing songs of forbidden glory to their desperate souls. Though they have dwindled and are weary, the High Elves still have a great part to play in the world before the final act of their long drama is played out. The High Elves are governed by a very complicated and bureaucratic nobility. The noble families have led our people through times of peace and conflict for thousands of years. They pride themselves on their deep sense of honor and mastery of both the arts of diplomacy and war, taught to them from a young age. In times of conflict, they demonstrate this prowess through their flexibility, perfectly capable of fighting with unmatched skill in the thick of the melee, or commanding our armies from a distance, directing the flow of battle as need dictates. Vacated by Umthwe Windrider, Herald of the Phoenix King. Ulthuan is ruled by a collection of princes, princesses, and mages, above whom preside the Phoenix King and the Everqueen. The relationship between these rulers is not as simple as the titles would suggest. The kingship is elective, while the queenship is hereditary, and both monarchs maintain entirely separate courts. The Everqueen is always the Queen of Avalorn. Her realm is the site of the principal shrine of the Earth Mother, and she is regarded as the spiritual leader of the whole Elven realm. The position of Everqueen is always taken up by the firstborn daughter of the previous queen, conceived during her year-long ritual marriage to the Phoenix King. After this formal marriage, they are free to take new consorts, but only the daughter conceived from the marriage of the Phoenix King and the Everqueen can be the new Everqueen. Hence, the Queens of Avalorn have always been the Everqueens of Ulthuan, forming an unbroken chain from ages past. By contrast, the Phoenix King is chosen from among the princes of Ulthuan, 1 year after the death of the previous incumbent. Each is crowned during a holy ceremony held at the massive pyramidal shrine of Aenarion, and attended by the legions of the Phoenix Guard and the princes of Ulthuan. The process of choosing the new Phoenix King is rife with intrigue. Emotions often run hot during this fraught and delicate event. Traditionally, The last 30 days of the year of mourning are set aside for the election to take place. However, in practice, the debate starts much sooner than that. Often the politicking starts long before the reigning Phoenix King has died. High Elves love intrigue, and never is the prize greater than when a new Phoenix King is chosen. Outside of this monarchical structure, Ulthuan is comprised of 10 independent realms, each ruled by its own princes. Each of these realms form into 2 distinct geography, the outer and inner kingdoms. The former are those whose shores touch the ocean, while the latter are those that surround the inner sea. The inner and outer kingdoms are divided by the cloud-piercing Aenarion mountains. The Aenarion are almost impossible to cross, save by certain passes and tunnels, and even then, travellers must contend with the perilous beasts that shelter amidst the crags and catacombs. No elf has ever walked to the very summit of one of the Aenarion and spoken of it, but legends abound of an otherworldly realm beyond the clouds, where ancient gods hold court. Due to the extreme saturation of magic within Ulthuan, these rumours of supernatural beings may prove true. The inner kingdoms, set within the twilight ring of the Aenarion, are shielded from contact with the outer world by the mountains that surround them and the buffer states of the outer kingdoms. Many of the inhabitants of the inner lands are introverted and dreamy. They make scholars, mystics, and sorcerers without peer, but all too often are affected by a languor that means they rarely bestir themselves, except for the most pressing and dire of circumstances. These kingdoms are the kingdom of Eataine, Caledor, Aenarion, Avalon, and Safari. The outer kingdoms are the elven realms that line the coast of Ulthuan's outer shores, which border the Great Ocean. Unlike the relative safety of Ulthuan's inner kingdoms, the lands of the outer kingdoms are open to hostile invasions, either from their dark relatives to the west, or chaotic barbarian warriors of the east. As such, the inhabitants of these lands have replaced their books and poems with swords and bow, and are perhaps the most warlike of their civilization. The outer kingdoms comprise of the kingdom of Tiranoc, Nagaraith, Kothic, Krace, and Ivres. The High Elves' existence is one of eternal battle, fought with a courage and skill that only they possess. But it is a war that, little by little, is being lost. The High Elves fade, whilst their enemies multiply, and each death is a loss that the 10 kingdoms of Ulthuan can ill afford. Yet it is not in the High Elves' proud nature to pass peacefully from history. When the Phoenix King issues the call to war, his people gladly answer. Disciplined spearmen form up in silence, their brilliant banners of lion, horse, and eagle fluttering in the wind. 40 knights ride alongside their steeds, reacting instantly to unspoken commands. Mages prepare intricate spells, archers gauge the gusting wind, and in the skies above, mighty dragons and phoenixes wheel and soar, ready to fight to the last alongside their elven allies. In matters of war and politics, the High Elves, true to their prideful nature, have only ever cared about the protection of the world, yet not those innocents that live within it. Whilst the High Elves consider themselves defenders and protectors, that calling doesn't necessarily extend to the protection of other races. Only a relative handful of High Elves see the lesser races as something worth protecting, and even they believe that these races must occasionally be saved from themselves. The rest, at their most generous, consider foreigners an additional set of defences with which to preserve Ulthuan. living fortress walls to be reinforced or abandoned as the larger scheme of battle dictates. This is not to say that the High Elves never fight alongside other races, but it is true that such alliances seldom come. Fighting alongside these variety of infantry units, mages, cavalry, dragons, phoenixes, princes, lords, and everything else. There are several notable characters worth mentioning here. Aenarion the Radiant is the current Everqueen of the High Elves and the 11th to rule since the time of the Phoenix King Aenarion many thousands of years ago. Aenarion, like previous Everqueens, represents the mortal embodiment of Isha, mother goddess of the elven race. She is the spiritual heart of all of Ulthuan. Her glowing hair is like a golden cloud. It is said that so great and timeless is her beauty that it can move even the immortal gods to tears. Malekith Caledor, the Shadow King and Prince of Nagarath, is the current ruler of the Kingdom of Nagarath and the last of the noble line of House Anar. Tradition maintains that the Nagarath choose Malekith as ruler after Malekith fled to the west. The Lord was the last heir of a great line, his forebears having been slain by the Witch King's minions. Eltharion the Grim, Prince of Yvresse and Warden of Tor Yvresse, is one of the greatest of all elven lords. Many times has he achieved what would have been thought impossible. It was Eltharion who was the first of Ulthuan's generals to dare an assault on Nagarond itself and live to speak of it, and he who finally brought about the defeat of Grom. For his valour in that battle, Eltharion was elected Warden of Tor Yvresse, and though he is a dour ruler, the people of that fair city love him dearly. Prince Imric, Crown Prince of Caledor and Lord of Dragons, is the last descendant of the first Archmage Caledor Dragon Tamer. He is amongst the few who can rouse the slumbering drakes in times of strife, and is acclaimed as the greatest warrior upon Ulthuan, perhaps save for Prince Tyrion. Though he knows it not, his bloodline's fate is intertwined with the elven species. If Imric should die, his entire race will follow soon after. Prince Teclis, High Lawmaster of Hoeth and Warden of the White Tower. Considered by many to be one of the greatest and most powerful spellcasters the world has ever known, Teclis is the twin brother of Tyrion, the famous elven hero, and the widely proclaimed defender of Ulthuan. Being of the line of Aenarion, each of his descendants are destined for greatness amongst the 10 kingdoms. This has made Tyrion a masterful warrior and general, and in turn, this greatness makes Teclis one of the most powerful living mages in the world. And lastly, Prince Tyrion, heir of Aenarion, champion of the Everqueen, and defender of Ulthuan, is the greatest living High Elven warrior of this age. So valiant and skilled is he that the bards of Ulthuan sing that he is nothing less than Aenarion reborn, a tale that is given credence far beyond Ulthuan's shores. Since Tyrion's meteoric rise to fame, many have whispered of his destiny to lead the High Elves towards a glorious future, and perhaps one day to take the Phoenix crown. If Tyrion hears such gossip, he pays it no heed, for he is unswervingly loyal to Finnabar, the current Phoenix King of Ulthuan. Thus does Tyrion concern himself only with the twin duties of protecting Ulthuan and its Everqueen, the beloved Aenarion. And lastly, Finnabar, the seafarer, is the current Phoenix King of Ulthuan. He was already famous for his voyages to the Old World before being elected by the princes of the High Elves. Finnabar is described as tall, narrow of face, and keen of eye. Indeed, the handsome monarch is noted for having a look of one whose eyes were always seeking the next horizon. With green eyes that matched the thousands of gems set within the Emerald Gate of Lotham, his blonde hair is almost as pale as the cloaks of his white lion bodyguards. Well, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly had an amazing time researching, reading through old Warhammer books. That was a particular highlight. Googling and looking at all the amazing lore and pictures that will go alongside with the High Elves. I won't pretend that I've covered everything, but I'm relatively happy with what I have covered. I hope you enjoyed that. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll speak to you all soon. Goodbye.